Influence is the things that we come up with as solutions. So the technical aspects, the processes through which we address what those problems are. Right? And then these processes then determine what our outcomes are. Whether these outcomes are reproductive, that means they keep the status quo going, they keep things as they are, or they're transformative, that they change things from the way that they, from the status quo. So there's what we call Discourse 1 and Discourse 2. Discourse 1 serves to maintain the status quo. This is not really being clear. Okay, so Discourse 1, it'll get clearer. Discourse 1 maintains the status quo. Discourse 2, it changes, it challenges the status quo. Okay, so I am a student, and I'm a student at your school. I'm constantly late. I don't do the homework. I don't have my sharpened number 2 pencils. The Discourse 1 is he's uninterested, he's lazy, he's not a good student, right? There's something wrong with me. Discourse 2 then would move us away from that. It would reframe that idea. What are the things that are impacting Eric as my student that leads him to be unprepared for class, tardy for class? Does this make sense? Then I should have done that from the beginning. In Discourse 1, what you're hearing are singular truths, right? He's lazy, he's unprepared, he's late. Discourse 2 allows for multiple stories. Well, I had a student one year that was late because they lived far away, and so they had to travel in. I had a student who was tardy because he was actually responsible for taking his siblings to their school, and then he came to his own classes. Right? Discourse 2 allows for the space for there to be multiple stories. Discourse 1 looks for answers and technical fixes. Well, if he's late, then what we need to do is get him a cab, and we'll pick him up. All right, that might solve the thing, but it won't solve the underlying thing, the root cause. Maybe I'm late because I'm taking my siblings to school. Are you then going to provide a cab for me to take my siblings to school every day? That technical solution cannot be the end of it, right? So when we move past that into inquiry and adaptive challenges, it's, all right, so maybe the CAD will help in this area, but what else? What's the underlying cause? What's the root cause, and how can we get to that? Discourse 1, we're looking to improve what already exists. If we're saying that we're functioning in a broken school system, then we're looking, okay, day 1, we're looking to put duct tape on these broken ladders. The broken ladder stays broken, but we can figure out how to work around it. In Discourse 2, we're looking at that broken ladder, and we're looking at it for all its pieces. We're looking at the hole that it's standing in. We're looking at those underlying, how did that ladder come to be broken? Discourse 1 allows me to look out the window, and that's it. Those people over there, they're messing up. Those people are lazy. Those people. It disconnects me from those people. Whenever you hear, I think that's a good clue. Any language that separates me from that, anything that breaks this sense of community, for the most part, can be called Discourse 1. Discourse 2 then says, okay, I see what's going on out there. How am I contributing to that? What are the things that I'm carrying, the things I'm believing, the choices I'm making that are connected to that impact that? oh, there's poverty in that country over there. Oh, maybe it's because I shop at a store where what they look to do in order to increase their profits and decrease their expenses is they ship jobs overseas and they mess with the economy over there. That's why I can get my cheap whatchamacallits. Now I will say that it's not enough to just say discourse 1 bad, discourse 2 good. It's being able to recognize, okay, this is what's happening right now. How do we move it over to this? It's less important to say good, bad, more important to say what do we do with it, which is what was said earlier around bias. Discourse 1 says, well, the problem is so big, and there's so many pieces to it, there's so many moving parts. What are we going to do? Throw your hands up, walk away, go eat a burger. Move on with your day. Right? The problem is so big, I'm not going to do anything about it. Discourse 2 says, yes, the problem is huge. I didn't make it. I didn't start it. But we're gonna go and do something about it anyway. We're going to get started anyway. In order to shift the discourse from discourse 1 to 2, we need to recognize when discourse 1 is happening, when reproductive discourse is happening. We need to say, I recognize this, now I need to interrupt it. So I might do that by asking a question. So your student is late all the time, and you think he is lazy or just doesn't care about school. Could you tell me more about what other things you think could be contributing to him not showing up on time? And in this way, you're shifting. So if before this, my teacher who thought I was late to school because that was fun for me, is asked a question about what other stories could be playing into this person can now move to, oh, well, yes, okay, I didn't think about it before, but there are all these other reasons why he could be late. Or I don't know why he's late, let me go ask him. Okay, so in the spirit of getting started anyway, I want to transition over to Brett.
I'm actually going to do an audible right now.
Call?
So, because as Eric was walking you all through that, can you go back to the previous there? Okay. So, there was a seminal article for us, at least, that sort of laid out this notion of discourse. There's I think he's no longer with us, but he was a professor at Michigan, or University of Missouri, Kansas City for many years. Ralph Parrish is his name, and he and a couple of other authors wrote this article called Shifting the Discourse in Schools. And, you know, in the previous session, we were talking about hegemony and hegemonic discourse. So the article sort of posits that schools in particular are places that tends to reproduce a set of outcomes. They're reproductive institutions, right? And that the discourse in schools that the authors call Discourse 1, seemed to prevail a lot, that had some of those characteristics. And so the idea was, how can we go about shifting the discourse to a discourse that's more productive, that will challenge the status quo rather than maintain it? And it made me think about some of our discussion yesterday, particularly when you broke into your groups, about how to take this back to your sites and to engage with your colleagues, where you might be finding yourselves laden with some discourse 1 when things come up in the context. So can anybody shout out for me an example of something you might hear at one of your staff meetings, or some discourse that is kind of reproductive? Can anybody think of something from your own context? You don't need to call anyone out, but just it frustrates you. You're in a meeting, it's like that narrative comes up again. It's a discourse.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going to go. But like we have to have parent events, you know, every other month or whatever, and parent meetings. And I think people come in just already with the attitude of they're not gonna come anyways. So trying to get to the point of, well, how are we presenting that? Because if we go in with the idea, it's kind of like that, you know, people live up to your expectations. If I expect that you're not gonna come, then I'm not gonna push you to come either.
Yeah. Does that resonate with people? Why do we do this? Parents aren't gonna come anyways. Yeah.
These kids can't read.
And what's the discourse under that? How is it framed? So that might be described as a fact. What's the discourse underneath that sentiment?
Well, I mean, really we're talking about bias, implicit and explicit bias, I guess, when you hear a statement like that. But like, where's the discourse that we should be getting to and around that is like, what are we doing to prepare our students to be successful? How are we building in them the skills they need to be academically successful in the context of our school?
Great. So Aaron did a shift there. Here it's some narrative. These kids can't read because they're unprepared, they don't get help at home, you know, whatever all those things are. And then shift it, well, instead of externalizing and blaming all the conditions, turn it, like, what are we doing? What's our complicity in this? What are we doing to reproduce? So that's part of that shift, right? Anybody else got another example? Like discourse that you hear that either frustrates you or it feels like, yeah, that's part of the...
So I've been in high school for 4 of my 7 years, so I came from elementary, and the first thing I got to hear, and I still hear to this day, and I always jump when someone says it, I have no idea what these teachers were doing in elementary school through 8th grade, because these kids don't know anything when they get here. Whew. Okay, so the implication is, it's not my teaching that's the problem, or my approach, or my relationship building, or whatever I have broken in my classroom, but it's everything all those other 9 teachers did before me.
Great example, resonates? So again, not an analysis about, it's not that there may not be gaps, but where do we attribute the cause for the gaps? And sometimes discourse 1 goes to blame, it doesn't help transform anything. Any thoughts about a shift? How does that discourse get shifted? If you heard that sentiment given, what might you do to recognize it's discourse 1, it's unproductive, and get it to be shifted to a different kind of discourse? Because the intention is we got to get to the gaps. We got to try to narrow the gaps. Any thoughts?
TBTs, building leadership team meetings, district leadership team meetings, they bring them together and talk about what each grade level needs, what the needs are amongst each other. And
Beautiful.
So those conversations begin right there at the TBTs and the BLTs.
Yeah, so a shift might be, why don't we get some vertical teams of these people and start to figure out what our challenges are, rather than blaming. Yeah? Great way to shift the discourse. So you're following me with a couple of these examples? So let me ask you to turn into your teams, and maybe you can identify what's some discourse that we keep hearing. So when you're thinking maybe even about going back later this week, next week, into a context where you might start hearing discourse 1, maybe start to give an example. Here's some discourse we hear. What might we do to actually shift it? And what's our plan? And how do we do that? And what do you say to shift the discourse? Is that clear? All right, go ahead. All right, wrap up that thought. Let's come back together as a whole group. So we think that there are a number of skills that we hope that the leaders in this room that are going to be part of this Equity Fellows Initiative will be doing once things kind of get up and underway. And some of that is to shift discourse, right? So Just want to hear if there are any particular, you can get descriptive about the kind of discourse that you're hearing that you want to interrupt, but also any thoughts about approach in how to shift. So if you can see yourself going back in a meeting, you're an equity fellow, you're stepping into some leadership for yourself about how to carry things forward. Do you have any ideas about the approach or the strategy to help shift some of what you're invariably going to hear? Strategy or a tactic would be a tactic.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about how we hold students to a standard, but not always, and we don't always hold ourselves or the educators, the adults in the building to a similar standard. And so as we were talking through that process, being okay with addressing those with our colleagues, addressing those ills with our colleagues as well. So instead of calling out, Mr. Johnson said, we'll say a student's name in a meeting, like, well, so-and-so is doing this behavior, how are you all addressing this? But if we see a teacher performing a similar behavior, we won't say their name out loud, or we won't say to that adult, you're escalating this or you're triggering this behavior. So just holding everyone to the same standard of accountability is what we really need to work on to address discourse.
Thank you.
Okay, Mrs. Utley had a really good response to the situation, because the question was what types of statements are made that can frustrate, and it's about how poor the kids are going to behave, how their academics are. And then, but what she was mentioning I thought was really something, is discussing and talking about what grit and determination is. And doing that, looking in the mirror of her own experiences. And so I've had to do that too when they talk about those kids. Really, I'm one of those kids. So it's very easy for me to reflect on their other strengths. There are lots of stories that we can pull from ourselves, our own experiences, to share with those teachers that may be sincerely wrong.
Great, really appreciate that, so what I heard in that is a way to interrupt and shift the discourse and say, let me tell you about my experience. My experience is this, seems comparable to that young person, and that's a strategy to interrupt and shift the discourse in a different direction. Also, the strategy I heard over here is about naming, well, what we hold our kids to account for, I'd like to see us hold ourselves account to the similar kind of account. So again, a strategy, a way to shift the discourse. Other things you may have talked about. Either discourse you want to shift, or any strategies or approaches.
We didn't speak about it particularly in my group, but I was just doing some self-reflection. And I was thinking about, you said it, where like sometimes the discourse can be, these kids can't read, and then we blame the teachers that came before. And so one thing I was thinking about is instead of saying these kids can't read, or I have to teach them how to read, it's I get to teach them a new skill. So changing that narrative from what you have to do versus what you get to do, it comes off more as an opportunity for growth.
There's something about, there's a gap there, and that's a challenge, and it motivates me to do something different. It might motivate us to do something different. And shifting it from we can't do anything about it to we have an opportunity to do something about it.
To piggyback on that, you can appeal to their ego and say, well, you're right, they can only read at a 5th grade level and they're in 10th grade, but look what you've done with this and this, and you could totally have them reading 2 grade levels higher by the time the year is over. So sometimes you have to, move the person in a direction, not just in a positive, like you have the opportunity to do this, but also to appeal to their ego and challenge them to do so. And that's to the benefit of the student.
Maybe one other thought, yeah.
I think sometimes it can be super overwhelming, the amount of like, you wanna frame them as problems, issues like that we face, but I think something this discussion like just now illuminated for me is not all problems need a solution right now, but what they could definitely benefit from is just a shift in the discourse. So like a problem can be like no closer to being solved, but if I change my like mindset or approach to it, that somehow puts me closer to solving it, even though I don't have any of the answers yet.
Right, it's not a quick fix, but if you change the mindset about how to approach the thing, it can interrupt a set of patterns and habits. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, please.
I think sometimes schools and school districts do things for their own convenience rather than what's best for children. And I don't think they, when we're trying to address what the causes of things are, we don't necessarily look what we're doing to cause the problem in the first place. I've never understood why you expect high school students to go to school at 7 o'clock in the morning when every research in the world knows that they are not, nocturnal people. The developmentally that they should not be in school probably till 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. So I think sometimes we do what adults do, what's good for them, not what's good for children.
Right. Appreciate that. So I think I'm hearing the strategy or the approach there is sometimes to just say out loud, I'm hearing us, blame kids, rather than seeing how we're a part of the strategy, what we're doing is contributing to this. I'd like us to examine what we're doing. So again, taking the externalization and turning it this way, either by leveraging your own experience or posing a question. Well, I'd like to know, how are we contributing to that effect? What are we doing that's making that happen? So these are some approaches that we think you might think about how to employ when you get back, when you're going to start having some of those conversations and pointing out some of those things in your places of work. Might be starting next week, might be starting a couple months down the road, but that's going to be sort of the arc. Any other example we want to lift up, or a strategy or approach that you talked about that would be important to get in the room?
Because they're not raising their hands. So at this table, there was a conversation around the resource of time. That is, that's a huge part of why things can't get started or why we can't do a thing is because we don't have time, and there are pull-out services and myriad of reasons all centered around time. And looking across to the next column is, all right, so while you have them, get started anyway. Whatever it is that you can do, get started anyway. And the way I connected to this was our time here together. If you look at where we are on the agenda and you looked at what time it's supposed to happen, no, they don't match anymore. Because we took the time, we invested this resource in places where we as a group felt it was important. The conversations that we had around this topic earlier brought us to a place where now we can have a conversation around this thing now, right? And so we have the same amount of minutes together. This resource of time points out what our priorities are as a group, and then what we're willing to hold up as important. Get started anyway. You have a kid for 8 hours? Between you and the kid, what's important? Where's the value?
So after Eric rudely left us to continue leading a larger group, Sarah and I were discussing the impact of that on academics, that when we were in the classroom, when we walk beside teachers in the classroom, I scheduled 30 minutes for this, especially math. I mean, we know that math is a sticking point for a lot of our students, but we scheduled 30 minutes for us to go through this concept, and it's gonna take 30 minutes. Although we all know, as being that professional, that we end at 30 minutes and we still have a lot of blank stares, and we're not being reflective enough and adapting to those children's needs. and saying what's really important is not that I'm moving on to that next page of that math book because I need to finish that workbook, but it's that they understand that concept, that the look in the mirror for us is not that we hold that knowledge, but really that we look and see that we imparted that knowledge in a meaningful way. And I think that we collectively can struggle with that with all the other pressures to look in the mirror and say our goal is not just to cover page 37 and 38 today. It's that our kids understand that content and can use that in a meaningful manner.
All right, a last thought from anyone?
To piggyback on what she had to say, we typically, I don't think, start where children are. We start where we think they should be. So we don't assess the children's needs, even if they're in the 8th grade or 3rd grade. But in the 3rd grade, they're so far apart, but we don't address those particular needs. We treat them all like they're one big group, and they all should be at the same place at the same time, and they're not. I mean, I taught 3rd grade or 6th grade 30 years ago. And we did something novel. We took every child that was in math in each classroom, assessed where each child was, and we started at that skill that day until the end of the year with that child. Children, I had 30 kids in the classroom. 30 kids were in 30 different places. But by the time the end of the year came, some of them had made great growth, and some of them were still back where they were, but we had to go slow. I mean, they didn't all learn at the same rate. So why would you expect if they didn't learn at the same rate for them all to be in the same place at the same time? It's, I think we just really, I don't know, things, we need to look at everything, starting at the very beginning, all over. I mean, we work for Head Start. We get a lot of grief that, well, for the, what are you doing? By the time they get to us, they still don't know their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. Yeah, but you don't know where they were when we started with them. Some of our children, we had to spend a year and a half just working on self-esteem, letting them know that yes, you can learn, yes, you can do these things. Other kids come to us with that, and they grow by leaps and bounds. But you have to start where they are, and I don't think we do that.
Appreciate that. That's a good segue for me to this next piece about this fancy term we're calling targeted universalism. So again, it's this kind of novel idea connecting to what you just said, Sandy, about meeting people where they are and providing particular targeted strategies to enable people who are situated differently to each other and relative to goals to reach a goal that we have for them. So let me jump ahead through this. Some of this work comes from an academic, John Powell, who currently he's a professor at UC Berkeley, but he had been at Ohio State, University of Minnesota before that. He didn't coin this phrase, but he's used it a lot, the notion, the term targeted universalism. So let's try to unpack what that is. Typically, we have programs or approaches that are universalist. Who can tell me what that means? If something's universalist. Yeah, one size fits all. Right? So it's a universal thing. We're going to do one thing universally. As maybe different from a targeted approach or a targeted program. What does that mean? Yeah, so something that's targeted for that either individual person or that group. So what he's positing is that there might be a third way that's trying to do some targeting, but within a context of universalism. So let's kind of unpack that. So what is it? It's kind of an approach for achieving equity that sets universal goals for all populations. And some of that, setting that goal is something that we want everybody to have or we want everybody to achieve, but it identifies targeted strategies that are aimed at the structures that impede some populations from achieving that goal. Does that make sense? So think of maybe that ladder image. People are situated differently, and there are structural reasons why they're situated differently. It's not deficiencies based on the person or the individual. It's systemic. So targeted universalism is, you do two things. You set a universal goal for everybody, but then you target strategies based on the structural things that are getting in the way for some populations. So this is the shorthand. Targeted universalism is universal goals and targeted strategies. The more common approach is you set universal goals and you have universal programs or you have universal strategies that are supposed to work for everybody. The problem with that is it's almost always the result is a universal program isn't really universal. Because of what we talked about. Because of biases, because of structural racialization, because of a lot of different things, history, everything. Universal programs almost never help everybody universally the same way. So let's use a couple of examples. A couple of universalist programs where they were supposed to be universalist. The GI Bill was supposed to be universalist. The strategy was give federal money to returning GIs so that they could either get a voucher and go be educated, or they could get a low-interest loan to start a business, or they could buy a house at a low interest rate or get a loan. But what happened with the implementation of the GI Bill? Did it universally help everybody succeed in the same way? Yeah. Not equal access because of some of the structural problems, so that black GIs came back. They had the voucher. It wasn't the federal government denied them the voucher, but when they went to enroll at a school, they couldn't get matriculated. They said, go to the HBCU. They went to the HBCU. The HBCU was so underfunded, they didn't have any money and couldn't accommodate all the black GIs that wanted to enroll. So by the time 5 years passed after the implementation of the GI Bill, 1/5 of the black GIs had actually enrolled in post-secondary education, even though they all had the federal voucher. So that wasn't universalist at all. It was selective. Universal health insurance. So before the Affordable Care Act, Massachusetts implemented this under Governor Romney. One of the things they found is the issue was if we give universal health insurance to everybody, people will be healthier, they'll have access, and they'll be healthier. But what they found is there are particular regions where it wasn't just that they needed health care, but they also needed a clinic and physicians to be able to go to, and that wasn't the case for some populations. So it wasn't just that universally, if we give everybody the ability to have insurance, that's going to actually achieve the outcome. Some populations needed other things. You need insurance, plus a clinic in your neighborhood, plus a physician who's willing to work in that neighborhood. All those things together. So sometimes when we think we have a program that's intended to help everybody the same, we should look at it with a different lens, because it's probably differentially going to be received by that population for structural reasons. You follow me? So targeted universalism is an attempt to try to deal with the shortcomings of universalist programs because we're situated differently. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. I can't do this right now, I wanted to, but this was a study, for example, that came out recently in March 2018. And there's a group, it's called Opportunity, if I can find it, I'll forward it around to you. Opportunity Insights, I think is the name of the entity now that focused on this research. So they did longitudinal looks at tens of thousands of families in the US. They looked specifically at black boys and white boys. because they felt like that was one of the markers of differentiation. So I wish I could do it, and I apologize for the bait and switch here. What happens on this website in the New York Times is it's animated. So you can click on it, and then all of the dots on that bottom part, the yellow dots are the white boys, the blue dots are the black boys. And then over time, it tracks them from when they were young people to when they became adults. And they tracked if you grew up poor as a 6-year-old, where did you end up on the spectrum when you were 30? And it shows that there's a much greater likelihood that if you're in the poor quintile and you're white, you end up in one of the other quintiles, you rise up. Whereas if you're black, you're more likely to remain poor as an adult. And then the inverse was true. If you grew up wealthy, and they tracked 10,000 families, 5,000 black boys, 5,000 white boys who grew up in the top quintile, what's the likelihood that over time as an adult you would fall out of that quintile? Much more likely if you were black, much less likely if you were white. So the question is, like, what are the structural factors that lead that to be the case? Who's got an idea? What are the structural factors that might explain some of those dynamics? Anybody call them out?
Justice system. Justice system.
Justice system. Great example.
Inheritance.
Inheritance. Educational opportunity. Sorry. Property values.
First generation, so if you're a first generation college student, how long does it take for your children to actually grow up into the college? That's what we do?
Yeah. Yeah. Generational passing along. Yeah. So the idea with targeted universalism is, it's a little bit tricky, this concept, is it's not about targeting the people, but it's about targeting the structures that get in the way. You following me? About the distinction there? So it's not about like, oh, we're going to target, we're going to figure out who's deficient and target the people, because that generally tends to lead to us to do things we don't want to do. It's about like seeing deficit in people and blaming the individual and the people, but instead you want to target the structures. So again, the same metaphor here. Some people ride up the escalator of opportunity. So again, in that example with the income over time, there are structural advantages for some populations and structural disadvantages for others. So again, the idea of the structure, there might be some people where the staircase was devised as a structural way to convey people from one floor to the other. But for this particular individual, that structure blocks access. So we got to think about remaking the structures to enable that individual and the class of people that individual is representative of, to enable to use the structures to get to opportunity. That's this notion of what is kind of an odd term, opportunity structures. So what we mean are those institutional, interinstitutional arrangements that are structural, that facilitate people getting close to opportunity. All right, so again, the point that structures matter. We said this yesterday. But what happens is, over time, with policies and practices, inequity results because in places, neighborhoods become disinvested neighborhoods, where people are cut off, or there are barriers, systemic barriers, structural barriers to getting to opportunity. And then what tends to happen is this negative stereotyping, biases, and othering comes as a result of that, because we try to explain ourselves. Why are these people structurally marginalized? Well, it's because of these stereotypes or these biases. It gets reinforced. All right, so here's kind of this crazy diagram that's kind of also try to maybe help drive home the point about what targeted universalism is. So on the left, so that green line is kind of the goal. And so there might be structural barriers that prevent some populations from reaching the goal. And there are structural advantages for some populations to get to the goal. So a universal strategy doesn't fix all the paths. We want to have a targeted path that focuses on the structures that are impeding progress for that population. So what's represented on the right are different multiple pathways to get to the universal goal that are going to look differently for different populations depending on how they're situated and how they're structured, what their access and proximity to opportunity is like, those structures of opportunity. So again, the concepts that are important is one of the steps is to set a universal goal, recognize how populations are situated relative to the goal, and then have some targeted strategies depending on that. But again, targeting the structures, not the people. Anyway, I don't know if people think that's novel or not, but that's sort of the idea of how to implement an approach. So let's go back to the GI Bill for a second. If the GI Bill were implemented with a targeted universalism approach, what might have been different? The implementation of that strategy, what might have been different? So was there a universal goal that was established for the GI Bill? Sounded like there was. It was like, we want all returning GIs to be buying houses, to be getting educated, but the implementation of it probably didn't take into account how populations were situated differently. It was like one size fits all. Everybody's going to do the same thing. So what might a strategy have been for the black GIs that would have been different than a strategy for the white GIs? Right, so it was before integration. So maybe another strategy would have been, we got to invest in HBCUs. Otherwise, those black GIs won't have a place to go. So it's just not just the voucher they need, but they need the voucher and they need a institution of higher education to go to that can accommodate them. Maybe a third thing is we need to invest in faculty development at those places as well, because there's going to be an influx of black GIs. All right, follow me? And there might have been, we could probably think of some other policies where instead of, again, the caution is be wary of a universalist program and think about how to implement a targeted program with a universal goal. All right. So here essentially are the steps. I think I've kind of walked through them already. But the steps of targeted universalism are: one, set the universal goal. Now, I'm not trying to pass over that quickly. That can be a fairly detailed, drawn-out thing. Because who gets to say what the goal is? So usually you want to have some co-construction of like what's important to people. So usually it's more common to go in a back room and set the universal goal for a whole bunch of people that aren't in the room with you. That would be a mistake. But you're trying to look for kind of that inclusive set of ideas and aspirations that everybody wants to attain and set a goal that's going to be good for everybody.
I think that's where we get stuck sometimes too, because especially as educators, we assume that the universal goal is to get kids to college. Maybe why are we sending children who have already shown that they struggle with academics into a college environment where they're piling up student loan debt and coming out and have nothing to do with it? Like why, I don't know that the goal always can be the same. Like, what if the goal is to be a financially stable adult? That looks different for different people. That doesn't always mean going to college. And I think that's where we get stuck sometimes.
Right. So I think that's the point, is that universal goal might be people having a living wage, people being able to have an income that enables them to buy a house and build equity in their house. And that might look differently, but you would target your strategies, whatever people need to get to that goal. All right, so the second step is to try to assess how the general population fares relative to that goal. Because probably there are some populations that are meeting the goal, and you would want to know what are the things that work that enable that population to reach that goal. That could get applied somewhere else. So step 3 then is identifying the groups and places that are performing differently with respect to that goal. That's about disaggregating. So usually with targeted universalism, it's good to have 2 things. The aggregated performance and then the disaggregated performance, because then you could compare. How's a particular population faring? But we want to know generally, by and large, how everybody's performing, because then we can see where there are differential ways of reaching a goal. The 4th step's important is then to assess and understand the structures that are supporting or impeding progress to the goal. And then the 5th step, develop the strategies that are targeted for particular populations that focus on the structures that get in the way. All right? So let's just do some practice. So, Eric, there's a worksheet over there. This might be another good time for us to get in our teams from our sites. On this worksheet, it just kind of has the steps of targeted universalism and some space to jot some notes. But again, it's like, how are you making meaning of this approach? And what's a particular thing that you might, and again, it's this caveat that you're not probably the people exclusively who are going to set a universal goal. That would be contrary to what I just said. For you to cook up a universal goal that's named by 5 or 6 or 3 of you. But just for practice, if you were to identify, here's maybe a universal goal that we think might happen. Here are then the other steps that we might be able to focus on in this exercise that will help us apply the concepts of targeted universalism. And then you can also just have a conversation about how this approach is striking you, what feels like it's useful, what's challenging for you, etc. All right, people know what we're doing? So you can either talk about the approach if the worksheet helps to actually run through the steps. Go ahead and do that. One more. Yeah. Eric. All right, and Eric and I will just kind of be wandering around if you need us. I know this can be kind of a heady topic. We can help, or if any of the Equity Fellows coaches can help, raise your hand, we'll come stop by. Yeah, Sandy, I see you.
So we actually kind of went on a tangent, but we ended up using these many tangents actually. It's late in the day. I'm looking up at the screen. That's why I'm looking that direction, so I apologize for everyone who's trying to figure out why I'm looking up. So we used these 5 steps, and we were talking about it with our new hires, just as how we were functioning and how we were serving some of our targeted needs of our districts. But when I first read through the list, or when you first read through the list, I was not thinking about it as building as us building our culture up. More, I was looking at it as services individually. So I thought it was served as a good icebreaker for some of the things that we do and why we do it, and giving us the opportunity to rationalize through that with new people.
Who else? How's the approach sitting with you? Questions you have? What's feeling sticky, as they say? today. I mean, there would seem to be a lot of buzz, so I'm hoping that there was some good conversation. But I'm gonna pause just one last time. Anybody got something you wanna bring in? Or a question, or a thing that you thought was particularly useful about the discussion you had?
I would just say, you brought up the whole idea of healthcare for all. And then when you start to break that down, you realize right away, every geographical area is different, every cultural area is different. So it probably is gonna have to be a very narrowing down of aspects of it. And it would be an incredible challenge to actually be able to meet the needs of all. But you do have to start by taking it apart and seeing what those individual needs are.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things that we find that's useful about the approach, but it takes some discipline, is once you've identified these goals and a set of targeted strategies, and you see what's required structurally to move the outcomes up for a particular population, is you can learn about what it took to move that population and apply it to move a different population. So in fact, that's one of the key things, is you don't want to just focus solely on one particular population and leave it there. It really is about setting a goal that's aspirational for all different populations, and then tracking and seeing what's necessary structurally to move different populations, because that will teach you something about how to do systemic change work. What does it take here? Can it be applied to a different population? If so, let's do it. And if not, how can we tune what we tried over here and do it over here with some success?
I think the important thing is you just have to keep assessing over and over and over again. I mean, like, our thing was, we talked about attendance, trying to improve attendance this year. And, you know, we wrote some things that we're gonna do to improve attendance. But, you know, as we go, we're gonna have to stop every couple of months and say, hey, is this working? Is it not working? If it's not, drop it. And if it isn't, try to come up with something different. But it's just, it seems like it is an ongoing crapshoot almost of what you can do to, reach that goal, that universal goal of having children attend school.
Yeah, I want to agree with your point and shift the crapshoot so that it becomes not a game of chance, but that we would try some things and try something else.
Exactly.
That's informed by what didn't work about what we tried. Yeah. Right. So there's a phrase that is important to us is, instead of trying to identify strategies that are fail-safe, we should try strategies that are safe to fail, so that we can learn from what didn't work and apply it somewhere else. All right, any other thoughts? I see you.
So I guess one of the things that I was really thinking about when we were looking at this was like the section, like number 3, where it talks about disaggregating for groups. That really jumped out at me because I think it's important to think about how we're disaggregating groups too, and the structures that we're using to disaggregate. Like, obviously, like race is a social construct, but like there are a lot of different ways to disaggregate data to get a lot of different outcomes. And one of the things that always jumps out at me is if you look up like college attainment for African Americans, like in general, you're gonna get one thing. If you look up college attainment for specific groups of people, you're gonna get other things. Like if you're looking up college attainment for Asian Americans, if you're looking up other immigrant populations, you're gonna get other data. And you can potentially overlook huge groups of people who have reached those milestones. So I just think that that's something that is really, I'm trying to be more cognizant of myself, is when I'm looking at data, trying to identify how I'm disaggregating that data. So.
Thank you. All right, so here's what I suggest we do. We've got maybe another 15 or 20 minutes before we close things up for the day. And so we know we've given you a lot to think about today. So we started out doing a bunch of stuff on implicit bias. We talked about culture. We talked about discourse. And now we left you with some stuff around targeted universalism. So let me just suggest that we take the next 15 minutes or so and really kind of focus on what do you think what's coming next for you and your teams. Is there a particular thing, just think about applying everything from the last couple of days, or maybe even just today in particular. What are the things that are standing out, and what do you want to try to do? What's coming next for you? So if there is something about engaging a set of staff people that aren't here, what's feeling sticky that you want to take up with a set of people next? Is there and Dave, maybe you want to?
Yeah, it might be helpful if we kind of jump in and say, one of our primary objectives for you this year, we've been intentionally vague about what kind of the long-term thing will be, but one of our primary objectives for you this year will be to help your staff and the people who are stakeholders within your building wrap their heads around the content that you would be talking about today that we'll be talking about this year. So the idea is you've gone through this amazing experience with two trained people who have been doing this for a long time. And no offense to any of you, but most of us haven't been doing this work for a long time, right? So what are the things that we want to make sure that everybody back home is gleaning to ensure that they're doing really well by kids this year? My hope is that all of us have personal insights that we can take away from this. And while we may not be able to impart all of those things to our colleagues, what are some of the highlights that we want to make sure get hit over the course of that year? So we'll cover this far more in depth when we begin to meet, but one of our expectations is going to be that you have a plan for how you're kind of building that capacity within your staff. So that's when he's saying take time to think about that. What are some of the highlights of things that you know, maybe even when they first come back this year, you want to be working into some of those conversations?
And I just want to add to that because I want to be inclusive of everyone in the room. So if you are what we're calling a hybrid member, you're new this year, but you're going to be joining a team that was actually in cohort 1. What you might be thinking about, and what we would invite you to think about, are what do you know to be true that has happened over the last year with your cohort 1 team, and what questions do you have about what you've learned today? Is there something you need answered? Is there a plan that you are aware of but you need more clarity on? So just know that you're going to be at a different spot when it comes to the plan that Dave's referring to, and we're going to do our best to get you up to speed with your teams as well. And of course, my team disregarding everything we just said.
All right, people have a sense for what you want to be doing in the next 15 minutes or so? So again, focusing on what's important, what are some of the highlights, what are some of the things that you want to be taking with you into a plan for the coming year, and then for the hybrid groups, the point about what's something that's happening in the cohort 1 that you have questions or you want to be integrated in on. So let's go ahead for the next 15 minutes or so.
And welcome back for the final. So this is not the end of this conversation. This is just the end of our time together in this formation. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your engagement. Thank you for the words. Thank you for your stories, for your ideas, for trying to co-create something that we don't know what it is, but we know that it has to be. Thank you for being willing to share the things that you've shared in the way that you shared them. What we want to do now is give you an opportunity to reflect on today, maybe the whole experience, on the facilitation, on the things that we talked about today, the questions that you're left with, things that could have been said differently, I don't know. What's coming up for you? What has come up for you? What are your resolutions? What are you looking forward to? Any thoughts, feelings, feedback? But just for a second, before we get to writing, I want to open it up to you. Do you have any appreciations, anything that you would like to say out loud to each other, anyone in the room, anything that you want to leave for each other?
Although we keep hearing the words messy and uncomfortable, and we're having to have conversations that we don't usually have, I'm actually excited about what's to come and what we're gonna get from this and what we'll be able to take back to our buildings, because I think that these are conversations and issues that we should have been having a long time ago, but there's no better time than right now.
I was just gonna say, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and come together to do this work with people from different districts and from different places and even different buildings. And it's such important things we need to do and change and deconstruct and reconstruct. And we can't change the entire world and the entire structure and systems that are meant to fail our children. But we can change the ones within our own buildings. We could be a powerful force, and then we can spread that throughout our districts as more and more schools become trained in equity, and we can start to make our schools more equitable.
So the processes that we've gone through throughout the past couple of days a thought keeps coming through my head. About another metaphor. You've used a lot of metaphors here that's been meaningful for me, and the need to be alternating between the dance floor and the balcony. So sometimes we need to be on the dance floor, and sometimes we need to step back and be on the balcony and watch and see how things are going. And this is going to be a lot of work over the next, the year of this, and then the next couple of years of continuing. So reminders that we need to step back sometimes and see how things are going.
Any other thoughts for the room?
I was just going to say that I appreciate the messy. Sometimes if we don't stop and really dig in a little bit deeper and really give ourselves the time to reflect, we don't see the messy that we have to deal with. So I really look forward to working together to unmess our messiness, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I suppose I would add to that I appreciate everyone's willingness to be vulnerable in the room with one another. And even though we all might be at different places in our journey toward the ultimate goal of the work, that we encourage one another. I myself am quite encouraged by everyone in the room in your willingness to be vulnerable, and hopefully that we can encourage everyone back at our building, wherever we're going to be, to kind of continue to push into that vulnerability for the sake of being good for our kids.
So I would like to extend gratitude to both Brett and Eric for helping us lead the beginning of our journeys the last 2 days. For those of you who are new in this space, there are a lot of people out there who do this work at a national level. We continue to use Brett and his team because of the experiences and the rapport and the attitudes that they embrace. And so I just want to say thank you to the two of you for doing what you do so well and helping it be okay to be vulnerable, be okay to be messy. So thank you to the two of you. I also want to just again from the perspective of an initiative within Montgomery County, I just want to say thank you to all of you in the room. I want to make sure my coaches understand that. Thank you for coming back for year 2. Thank you to Catherine for joining the team, and then to those of you who are in the room. This was a conscious decision. Again, we joked at the beginning that my team was voluntold to be here, but you chose to say yes to your building administrators for whatever reason, but you chose to say yes, and so that's a conscious decision to be in the work, to be committed, and to subscribe to the mentality. New phrase. So I just, again, I thanked you from a personal level when we started because I was already thankful for you. I've watched you the last 2 days begin this work. None of us are, it's just ongoing, right? We're never done, there's never a destination. But I really want you to hold the moment that you're feeling right now, because when we come back together in May and you do, we have a celebration for you, I'm gonna remind you of the moment that you're in right now. And so I really want you to hold it because it's a special moment. It's the beginning of the journey with your team and your building, and it's just something really special. So thank you for choosing to be part of the work.
I was one who was voluntold to be here, but thanks for having told us to be here. We oftentimes we see things a certain way, and this has just filled off a layer and helped me to see some things that I didn't know about myself.
All right, so we'll just let those comments live in the air, and we'll invite you to take your writing utensils and fill out these feedback forms. Again, thank you.
Well, let's just let you take a couple minutes to write silently, and then we'll officially adjourn just in a couple minutes.
Okay.